Let's start with Ingenious prep introductions. So I'll try to keep this very quick. I know that you guys didn't come here to hear about Ingenious. I came here to hear about admissions and the LSAT. What makes the organization unique are a few things. Firstly, we have over 150 former admissions officers and over 75 what we call graduate coaches, which are individuals who, like me, went to some of the most selective law schools in the US. We have a pretty expansive network of university professors and companies, law firms, NGOs, at which our students can do both academic and non-academic internships. We have a pretty large database. So we actually started this when I was a 1L at Yale, and my co-founder was a 1L at Harvard. And one of the things that we were trying to do is like disaggregate the law school application to all of its constituent variables, like where you're from, what you majored in, what school you went to, what your GPA was, what your LSAT score was, what your extracurricular activities were, whether you were a local, regional, or national champion in something. And so we put that through kind of a pretty rigorous regression analysis, and we got some pretty interesting, kind of factoids out of it. I mean, sort of some things that were somewhat unusual, like statistically the most successful major for applying to Stanford Law School was music. Obviously, that's in part due to the fact that so few people with a music degree were applying to Stanford Law School, but there was just a lot of interesting things in there generally. We learned a lot about the admissions process from examining it at that sort of bird's eye view. And then finally, our results. We have acceptances at every top law school. We do every year. Fundamentally, we believe that as long as you have got the sort of requisite academic qualifications, including and perhaps most importantly the LSAT, which Steve will talk about, if you're able to tell a convincing story on the application about your potential value as a law student and future lawyer, and particularly about the experiences you had and how they relate, sort of teleologically is not the correct word, but I'll use that word, teleologically, between what you have done and sort of the kind of future projection of you as a lawyer, that you will dramatically increase your chances of getting in. So this is just a look at some of the former admissions officers we have on the law side. I'm particularly fond of Gene and Christina, who both come into the New Haven office somewhat regularly. Gene was actually the first former admissions officer from a law school that we hired. She's really great. She was the director of admissions there for 16 or 17 years. So enough about the company. Let's talk about how applications are processed. So we'll start with some basic data. There will also be some true falses. So if I ask a true false, you do me a great service if you actually type an answer into the question and answer, or not the Q&A, just like the chat box, I think is probably easiest. That way it just feels a little bit more interactive. So one thing to note is that law school applications are going up. You can expect that not only will the velocity maintain, it will accelerate, which is to say that COVID and any kind of economic disruption tends to have the effect of driving people to apply to graduate school because the job market sucks. Not any good reason to think that wouldn't be the case here too. So all of you are unfortunately facing a slightly more competitive future applying to law school than you might have several years back. But this has been a trend for a while. Basically, after 2008, there was a pretty solid dip as law firms were kind of freezing hiring. A dip in terms of, the kind of first reaction was an increase. The second reaction was a dip, and then it's been sort of steadily increasing since then. I would say that safe bet it's going to continue getting increasingly competitive. How about this, true or false? Schools have an algorithm to determine who is accepted or rejected. Karen, we'll answer questions at the end if that's okay. We have a couple trues, predominantly false. Okay. I'd say it's like 1 to 8 ratio of true to false, maybe worse, maybe 1 to 10. Okay, so the answer is false. They use a process of holistic review in which individual admissions officers assess every portion of the application. Now, that does not mean that there are not students who are quote unquote auto-admitted because of their grades and test scores. I'm sure that happens. I am actually positive it happens. But for the overwhelming majority of students, it's not an algorithm. It is a holistic process in which an individual admissions officer or a professor, in some circumstances, is looking through the application and deciding kind of the sum of the parts, whether or not this student should be admitted or rejected. And so the important part is here is to not lose sight of the fact that all variables matter, and they're definitely the most important variables are definitely your GPA and your LSAT score. There's no question about that. But all variables matter, and although those two variables may be necessary, they are not in most cases in and of themselves sufficient to get you admitted. Usually, you need more. You need a quality application. So let's talk about how applications are actually processed. So one thing that I've noticed is that a lot of students who are interested in succeeding in competitive admissions processes actually don't have a firm grasp of how applications are reviewed once they're in the admissions office. And I think that that's really strange. I've always sort of likened that to trying to fix a car if you don't know how an engine works. So this is how it works. There's actually a fair amount of variability between law schools. It's not as, there's pretty standard processes for college. Law school tends to be a little bit different depending on the school, but the basic kind of infrastructure of it is you submit your application, you all know that. It goes on top of a stack of applications, might be in the thousands, tens of thousands of applications long, talking about like 100,000 plus pages of reading that the admissions office needs to do. Typically, they'll only have a few admissions officers, if any. These applications are then separated. Sometimes they're separated by region. Sometimes they're just separated arbitrarily. But the important thing is that an individual admissions officer is going to be assigned to read your file. At certain schools, for example, Yale being one of them, the applications are, in addition to being screened by the admissions office, they're submitted to professors, and 3 professors rate each individual application, and they give it a score. And then if you have the, sort of the requisite level score from each of the professors, or in the sum total, then you're admitted. And if you don't, you're deferred or rather waitlisted or rejected. But in most cases, it's not quite as involved with the professors. It's kind of a laborsome way, a cumbersome way of doing it. So the admissions officer who's assigned to your file is basically going to decide whether or not you make it to the next round. So your goal as an applicant, first and foremost, is impress that person. And so you can kind of think about it as your grades and the scores are essential to basically meeting the kind of core qualifications. And I think this is actually particularly true of the LSAT score, which has been shown to correlate pretty well with performance in the first year of law school. And in that way, the LSAT is actually quite different from other standardized tests, which don't correlate especially well with what they're supposed to correlate with. Like the SAT doesn't correlate particularly well with first-year performance in college. So the LSAT actually does measure something. It measures more or less what they intend it to measure, which is actually quite important. It's why the LSAT is so important. But the LSAT and your GPA, these are things that sort of, they get your foot in the door, but what sort of gets you through it is the remainder of the application, right? So it's sort of like those things qualify you, and then the rest of your application, your experiences, your activities, all of that, those are the things that sort of allow you to stand out and thereby increase dramatically the chances that this admissions officer pulls your application from the pile. After that, in typical admissions offices for law schools, the dean of admissions will review the top application and shape the incoming class. In some cases, there's sort of like a panel of admissions officers. In some cases, there's professors involved. That varies more considerably. But that's sort of like the basic outlay. Primary takeaway here, it's important to stand out, and it's extremely important to make a good impression on the first admissions officer, which is not something that can be accomplished solely with grades and test scores. So how will the coronavirus impact the law school admissions process? It probably won't. I think one way that it likely will, I've already mentioned, is that usually when there's an economic downturn, you see a commensurate rise in the number of graduate school applications. So I think it'll be a little bit more competitive. Obviously, these admissions offices have been set up to work remotely for a very long time, so it's not like the admissions process itself will be disrupted. The universities will probably move admissions operations online. I think that if you're attending this webinar, it's safe to say that you are, not currently attending law school. And what's more, you're probably, at least a year or so away from applying, in most cases for the people on this call, or on this webinar. So it's quite likely that by the time you're actually matriculating, things will be more or less back to normal, or, perhaps some new normal, but not quite as devastating and horrifying as our current normal. But I think that for the most part, I don't think that you should be worried too much about the sort of campus life. Plus, this isn't college. Like in law school, a lot of the work that you're going to be doing is independent. And while the social element is fun and it's pleasant, I wouldn't describe it as being strictly necessary to a successful law school experience. That's not necessarily what it's not as much about the sort of social elements as, say, college. I'm sure that Steve will talk more about this, but the LSAT canceled the in-person administration of the LSAT scheduled for October 3rd, and they're administering instead the LSAT-Flex, which sounds kind of like I don't know, the bodybuilder version of the LSAT. I'll let Steve talk more about that his section in a bit. I don't want to think he knows much more about it than I do. Just for reference, these are I'm realizing I didn't hit record earlier. Oh no, I did. Okay, good. I'm not going to get yelled at. So these are their schools that are kind of fully online or in person that have already been announced. I'm assuming that there will be a lot more announcements in the coming weeks. And I'm sure that there will be some schools that have gone in person that will roll that back. That seems quite likely. But again, I suspect that for the people on this webinar, whatever the kind of policies are today are unlikely to be the case 12 months from now. So I wouldn't be too worried about that. True or false? Already seeing some falses. Most law school candidates apply directly from college to law school. False. So obviously this is a terrible true false because literally not one of you said true. So most applicants have 1 to 2 years of work experience before going to law school. When I was at YLS, the median age of my class was something like 28 or 29. I was one of the youngest students at 23. I was 23. You should not feel compelled to apply directly out of college. That doesn't mean that applying directly out of college is inherently disadvantageous. It's probably not a benefit, but you can certainly do it successfully. I think that having extra time outside of law school is important to law schools, precisely because they think that sort of the emotional maturity that comes with those years and the certainty about what you want to do is very important to them. So taking time out of law school makes your argument that you genuinely want to go to law school and you know that for a fact, makes that a little bit more compelling. True, false. True, false. All right, yeah, so another strongly false. That is correct. The answer is false. I actually got a couple of questions about this in my inbox today, in my email. And I thought that they were kind of interesting. It suggested to me that the people who were writing it weren't as sure of this. It's important that you understand that law schools do not necessarily expect any law-related experiences when you apply. I certainly didn't have any. None of my friends who went to Harvard, Yale, and Stanford had any law-related experience when we were applying. You don't even need to major in, like, some people think that you have to major in, like, poli-sci or government or something like that. And even that's really not the case. Law school is truly one of the few graduate programs that does not expect prior experience. What I tell people generally is that it is much more important to have a clear passion. So for example, maybe your clear passion is education and educational policy, right? That's very interesting. It doesn't have to be clearly related to the law and the stuff that you do in college. You just need to be able to relate that to the law in the application. Explain how your prior experiences in educational policy or in education generally have led you to a career in law, and how do you want to apply the law to that interest, right? Or maybe it could be sports. I had a couple of friends at YLS who were interested in sort of sports management and stuff like that. And they'd done work for professional sports teams before they came to law school. And they had no interaction with the law whatsoever prior to that. But what they wanted to do is they wanted to get a law degree and then they wanted to become an agent, which is a somewhat unusual desire for a student applying to some of those law schools. But so the point is that it's not so important that you have a particular interest that is law related. What is important is that you have kind of a theme, something that we call an application persona. So if you could kind of summarize in like half a sentence how I should describe you as an applicant, that's what I need from you. Like, this is the future environmentalist, or this is the student who, or this is the education policy expert, something along those lines. That's the most important thing in terms of your experience, is that there's some sort of coherence in the activities that you've done. And the persona, RBG Junior, Ginsburg all the way. Let's talk about the kind of 4 critical factors in standing out. So I've already mentioned that, like, if you're going to impress that admissions officer assigned to your file, standing out is extremely important. And grades and test scores are only one in a kind of slew of variables that sort of allow you to stand out. So generally speaking, a kind of simplified paradigm of understanding what standing out means in the law school admissions process is as follows. So you sort of have threshold grades and scores, and this is sort of bracketed off for a couple of reasons. One of which is that I sort of think of this as a kind of necessary precondition to be qualified to be admitted. None of the remainders, I think, are necessary in and of themselves. Collectively, they are probably, though, all entirely. Which is to say that you can, it is not enough to just have an application persona if you don't have leadership and diversity, if you don't have direction and fit, so they're sort of jointly and severally necessary. The threshold grades and test scores is where we will begin. They are very important. If anybody tries to tell you that the LSAT or the GPA are not important for law school, they are definitely not telling you the truth. They are more important to law school admissions than the GPA and SAT scores were for college admissions. This is a statistical fact. So you should treat them kind of commensurately. The LSAT is a particularly intimidating test, I always thought, because it was like, several hours of test taking of equal importance to 4 years of grades. Steve's a great guy to talk to you about how to deal with that. But in terms of understanding scores generally, including GPAs, there are always exceptions. You should not expect to be one of them. In fact, generally speaking, I feel that the people who would be most grateful to become an exception are almost always the people who are not. That is to say, like, the people who don't study and do better on test day than they did in like practice tests. That's not you. The students who study, like, join these kinds of webinars, who study hard, work hard, they will invariably do slightly worse on test day than they do when they're practicing. Those are not the people who get lucky in that way. Fundamentally, these qualifications, grades and test scores, they answer the question, can this person succeed in the classroom? And as I mentioned before, both GPA, or I mentioned this in respect to the LSAT, but both GPA and the LSAT have predictive value in terms of whether or not a student is likely to succeed in the first year of law school and beyond. So that is kind of a big part of what they're looking at. There's kind of a second tier to this, which is that part of the way that the U.S. News and World Report ranks law schools takes into account admitted students' LSAT scores and GPAs. If they admit too many students with like a lower than average LSAT score GPA, they do risk potentially, diminishing their rank. I've never heard of an admissions office making such explicit calculations on a student-by-student basis, but I assure you that at the dean level, that is something that they are keeping in the back of their mind. They have this calculated. They have the averages calculated long before the class is fully taking shape. Many applicants with great scores get rejected. Happens all the time. So you should not assume that getting great grades and great test scores are both necessary and sufficient. They are not. Likewise, there are applicants with low scores who get accepted. We once worked with a student who got a 155 on the LSAT and got into Yale Law School. She had an unbelievable GPA, went to a top undergraduate school, had a lot of great work experience, and had done an academic research project with a very famous professor from Yale Law School who liked her so much he walked her letter of recommendation into the admissions office. So it's possible. I've seen it. There were, I've seen sort of these crazy circumstances. Again, don't assume that it's going to be you, but you also shouldn't be so disheartened by like a low GPA or a low LSAT score that you don't bother shooting for it. What's a splitter? For those of you who, I don't know if it's still trendy to troll toplawschools.com. I think that might have gone out of business a couple of years ago, but that was where it was at back in the day. All the neurotic law school applicants were hitting up those forums hard and trolling one another. And on there was a lot of talk of splitters, which were individuals who have either it's Reddit now. Oh damn. Well, that's too bad. You guys are really missing out on the 1990s web infrastructure of toplawschools.com. I'm sure that Reddit has plenty of trolling. High LSAT or low GPA, high GPA, low LSAT. Fundamentally, it should be obvious that if you have a low one of them, you want to have as high as possible of the other one. Generally speaking, if you're sort of like, 40th percentile, or something around there of each. It's better to be like 80th percentile of one and like lower, like 20th percentile of the other. That is partly anecdotal. I've seen some data to suggest that is the case. I've also talked with a lot of admissions officers who said that's the case. But it's not necessarily always the case. But it does seem to be the case that splitter is better than just sort of like, I don't know what the term for somebody who's just sort of like below average generally across the board. The GRE and GMAT trends. Schools have started to accept the GRE and GMAT. There are over 40 law schools that accept the GRE, including all of these. Generally speaking, a lot of you are going to be applying to 10 or so law schools. Some will apply for, fewer, some will apply for more. I would just make sure that before you choose which test you are going to take, that you maybe take a look at the list of schools that are accepting it and make sure that all of the schools you want to apply to accept it. I also feel a little bit like this was instituted during a period of time in which law school applications were not doing so well. I assume that they'll keep the policy. I'm not sure why they wouldn't. But I would err on the side of taking the LSAT. I genuinely think that the LSAT is sort of a valuable predictive tool, and I think that law schools see that too. And I'm not necessarily sure that you will benefit from taking the GRE or the GMAT. I think that probably, unless you have a good reason to take those, like you're also applying to business school, you're also applying to graduate programs, probably err on the side of the LSAT. GMAT, here are some of them. This is a quote from Gene Webb. I am doing okay with time, but not great, so I'm just going to hold it here for a second. And yes, the Q&A will be at the end, guys. Somebody said if they take both tests, which one would they prefer? There's no, they have not reported a clear preference, but based on my understanding and the conversations that I've had with the admissions officers, former admissions officers, I would assume that they would prefer the LSAT. Or at least behave that way. Diversity in leadership. Diversity, what I mean is ethnic, racial diversity, but there are many other forms of diversity. Other similarly situated applicants. Just one more time. Differentiates you from other similarly situated applicants. So that could be things like a particular academic interest or an extracurricular focus. It could be like a particular future passion in terms of how you want to apply to a law degree. It's something that makes you kind of unique. So for example, it could be like something like starting a nonprofit or starting a business. Things that are not going to allow you to become, things that are not going to help you diversity. Doing consulting after graduation, there's a lot of that. Unfortunately, law schools do tend to like Teach for America, but like a lot of kids from TFA are coming to law schools. So I'm not sure if I would necessarily call that, it's valuable experience. I'm not sure if I would necessarily call that unique or diverse experience. But not that either. Doing a political science degree, that's not going to help you be diverse either. Doing Model UN or mock trial, also not going to help you be diverse. Generally speaking, what you can think of this as sort of like, am I interested in something that is special? International law is very common, so probably not that. And if I'm not interested in something that is itself special or differentiatable, have I done something in relation to my existence, my sort of mundane or commonplace interests that is itself special? Have I done, have I published work alongside a professor? Or have I done a particularly interesting internship at like the UN? Those are things that will help differentiate you. And it's very important that you be able to communicate clearly on your application. This is what I've done or what I'm interested in that is unique. And this is how that will kind of communicate itself in class or on campus or as an alumnus. It is very, very important for them that these classrooms have an incredible amount of creative friction generated by diverse perspectives in the classroom. Leadership, also important. This should sort of go without saying. The title is not as important as the actual impact that you make. So if you say I was the president of X, Y, and Z, and you cannot, I was the president of X student organization on campus, my follow-up question is invariably, okay, well, tell me what tangible impacts you had in that position. If you do not have a good answer to that question, I really will not care about your title. So title is a part of it, but tangible impact is probably more important than title. It's also great if you start your own organizations. I don't see anywhere near enough students doing what I would consider to be entrepreneurial things in college who want to go to law school. There's a real dearth of entrepreneurship in sort of the law school context. Basically, nobody came from an entrepreneurial background. So if you started something in undergrad, that's great. And again, it doesn't have to be directly related to law. Probably, in fact, will not be. Direction and fit. Generally speaking, in your application, what you're thinking about addressing is sort of you, who you are, the law generally, why you want to be a lawyer, why the law should want you, and the law school that you are applying to. We call this the application trinity. You could just, it's just those three components are important. Things to avoid. If you answer, I'm going to law school because I think, I don't know what else to do, nobody's actually going to do that anymore. But you need to, as much as possible, assume that there is kind of for those of you who know the term, prima facie burden that is incumbent upon you, the applicant, to prove that you are going to law school in full cognizance of what law school entails, and not just because it is the next natural step in a career path, because that is like if you write that on an application essay, it really doesn't matter what your other qualifications are, you're getting rejected. Don't talk about making money. Not a good idea. Also, if you are talking about making money on the application, I strongly suggest you look into a career in investment banking because you'll work the same terrible hours, but you will make more money. So if making money is your goal, you probably came to the wrong place, or at least not the best place. Don't talk, you can say that you want a career shift, but don't lament too much about how miserable you are in your career, because again, that will sort of go back to them thinking like, well, then this person just thinks that like this is the next step because they don't know what else to do. Definitely don't say that like I'm applying to law school because I've been like I failed to obtain gainful employment for a long period of time, and I'm tired of living with my parents. Like that's not going to play well, and it should not seem like you are a degree collector. This is more of a problem for those of you who are not in undergrad currently, who have like already gotten another grad degree. There's a whole like category of people that just like that are, sort of flit from one graduate program to the next. I never really understood that until I actually witnessed it in my own generation of applicants and students, but try as much as possible to avoid that. So good reasons that you want to go to law school. Your personal and your professional goals. This is a really good place to explain how like the prior experiences that you've had with something like education policy correlate to a future career as like an education policy maker, and in what government body or in what organ or what international organization. You can address the skills that you hope to gain at the law school, skills that you wouldn't be able to gain elsewhere. And the goals, generally speaking, you want them to be forward thinking. They also should be concrete and manageable. Right? So if the goals like I want to be able to run for president, I mean, it's not completely unreasonable, but it's probably not a good idea. It should be something that's like a little bit more down to earth. So like I had a friend who he's now the deputy attorney general in Montana, maybe Wyoming, one of those, and he that's what he wrote about on his application to law school. He wrote about how he wanted to be like basically be in local politics, which was very successful for him, and in fact he's done. So try to be sort of down to earth with it, very concrete about what your goals are with law school. Here's some questions to ask yourself. I'm not going to read through these each in turn, but we can just pause for a second if anybody wants to take a screenshot or take a picture. It's totally fine. Just because we're paused here. Is federal clerkship a fair goal? It's a little bit prestige driven, where it's like every prestige driven student in law school wants to do a federal clerkship. It's also not really an end goal. It's like a means to an end. So I think that probably I would not use that as a career goal now. Okay. Fit. Why do you want to go to this law school? So every law school has its own culture and specialities. It's extremely hard to figure this out from the websites. The websites of these schools, if you just Control F and changed it to like anonymous school, I would not be able to tell the difference at all from reading them, except for where it was like anonymous school is located in New York. Like even then I would have a decent failure rate. I like to talk to people who have gone to the schools. That was much more valuable for me. So when I was an undergrad, I went to the career development office and I asked them to help put me in touch with some like alumni who went to different law schools and talk to them about like sort of personalities and stuff. All law schools, even the best ones, like there's a particular interest in their school. I've heard a lot of back and forth about this from existing admissions officers, particularly from like the Harvards and the Yales, saying, we don't need to know why you want to go here. We know why you want to go here. I've also heard an equal amount of comments from people who have left the admissions office who's like, yeah, but you should still probably say why you want to go here. And I've come to the conclusion that no harm can be done by at least including like a snippet, like 2 lines in your essays about why you want to go to that law school, and therefore you should do it. I have yet to be dissuaded from that perspective, nor have any of our admissions officers on the staff. You need to show what you're going to bring to the school's incoming 1L class. This kind of goes back to the question of diversity, right? What unique perspective do you have to offer? A high GPA and a high LSAT score, not a perspective. So what perspective do you have to offer? And that kind of ties in, that'll tie into the last section here, which is about the application persona. I'm now over time. How to demonstrate fit. You can show genuine interest and enthusiasm, do your due diligence in the school. I generally say you need to have like at least 3 good reasons why that particular law school and not others. And that last part is very important, the and not others. Because you can't just say things that are true of this law school and also true of all of the other law schools. You do genuinely need to have, answers that are specifically targeted at the law school that you are discussing. You should also talk about specific clinics and specific classes and professors that you want to work with. So you should have done enough due diligence that I could say, NYU Law School, what's your professor that you want to work with? What's the class you want to take? What's the clinic you want to do? And you should be able to rattle those off. That means that you've done your due diligence. Show how you will benefit. You should also be able to show what you'll contribute. So it's not just about what the law school can do for you, it's also what you can do for them. You should be looking at both of those things, right? And you should be discussing both of those things in the application. Here are 2 candidates. This is real qualifications, real credentials. What I would like us to guess is who gets into Harvard Law School. And I don't need to know why just yet, but let's just vote. It's Cindy or Jane. It's not both. All right, somebody humored me. 2 people humored me with this, Cindy. Is it really that obvious? Okay, yeah. So it'd be funny though if it were actually Cindy and it was just like gotcha. Everything that we said was a farce. Okay, so Jane gets into Harvard Law School, not Cindy. Why? So they both meet the sort of threshold. I would argue that Jane was actually slightly below the threshold for certainly for the LSAT for Harvard Law School, but had a strong GPA. Diversity and leadership. So Jane had a unique passion of environmental law that helps her stand out. She also made a clear impact on our community. So she has the sort of the leadership component. That leadership and their specific interests, that's what allows her to be diverse. That's what makes her diverse. She didn't have any other diversity factors, so to speak. Direction and fit. Jane had concrete details to support her unique career goals. Cindy had typical pre-law experiences that failed to show her specific goals. You'd be shocked to find that there are many more students like Cindy than there are students like Jane who have actually spent their college career sort of building a cohesive profile, which is funny because I think many people understand that you have to do that to get into a good college, but not always. Somebody wanted to see their profile. Consistent theme, we call that the application persona, and we'll talk about that in just a second. Here's the profiles. I'll give you 3 seconds. 1, 2, 3. You got it. Okay, application persona. The application persona is, think of it like a catchphrase of your application. It's how I would summarize your application after I'm reading it. So if I'm an admissions officer and I have to read, say, 500 applications, which would not be uncommon, how do I remember your application? The key is to have a theme, right? A theme that you're driving towards in the application, so that when I'm done reading it, I remember you as like the environmentalist, the education policy person, hopefully not like the future corporate law hack, something, the future legal academic would be like that'd be fine as well. but it's incredibly valuable for a couple of reasons. One is that it makes you a lot more memorable. So you're easier to sort of pull your application from the stack. Second is it makes you a lot more persuasive. If the application is a roughly 10-page argument for why you should be admitted, then an application persona is like your one glaring argument, like this is why I should be admitted. And an application like Cindy's that lacks an application persona is like 10 diluted weak arguments. And one really good argument, much better than 10 really weak arguments. So that's another component. The application persona should be centered around whatever passion or interest or experiences you've had that will sort of, it's kind of your diversity variable. It's sort of like, this is what will allow me to contribute uniquely. So for a student like Jane, it's environmental law. Some students, it's like education policy, international law, et cetera, et cetera. Ideally, it's something that you're deciding on earlier in college, and you're sort of building a profile around that, like doing summer internships related to it, doing research related to it, taking classes related to it, so that when you apply, you're actually quite advanced in your area of interest. Like, if you apply and said, I'm interested in international law because I took this one class in the poli-sci department, that's not very persuasive to anybody. It's like that's not a, it's like your persona is weak. You need to kind of build on it. Academic internships, real internships with like companies, nonprofits, et cetera. Very, very important. Okay. Only 8 minutes over. That's probably as good as I'm ever going to get. I will now turn it over to the very adept Steve and his amazing microphone, and I will mute myself.
All right. Thanks, Joel. Well, that was a fantastic overview, and I will do my best to live up to that presentation as well as the amazing microphone that I've invested so much work in putting together after several different attempts, different mics, but here we are. So the LSAT. What I have planned for this evening is to talk a bit about the LSAT in general, as well as the LSAT-Flex in particular. So I've put several resources linked in the chat here. I'll put them in again, as well as some more. So my LSAT journey has been quite a long one. I've been teaching the LSAT since 2005. I never thought I would be doing this. I really just wanted to go to law school, but the LSAT was just this one exam that I could not crack. I took exam after exam after exam, and my scores would not go up. They just stayed in the low 150s until I changed my approach. I stopped taking exam after exam and obsessively measuring my results. I switched my approach to engaging in detailed review of the problems that I was completing. And that's when things really turned around for me. So I started teaching the LSAT. I started teaching it one-on-one through tutoring. I then started teaching classes in New York City in person. Then a couple of years ago, I started making videos and started doing online classes. And then, as I mentioned earlier, due to COVID, that really became the sole focus. And I went from teaching 2 to 4 classes per month to 2 to 4 classes per week. And all along the way, I said, you know what? I love teaching. I'm never going to go to law school. So even though I eventually increased my score approximately 23 points from the 152 to a 175 on test day, I decided not to go. And I probably could have gone to a pretty good law school. My GPA was around 3.3, 3.4, and numbers aren't everything. So I may not have needed a 4.0, 177, like the example on the left from earlier. Maybe those lower numbers plus some ECs would have been good enough. But I said, you know what? I love what I'm doing. Why change it up? So since 2008, I've been running the LSAT Blog, which is a website with over 1,000 articles on everything LSAT prep. I've got a bunch of free resources, as well as guides, cheat sheets, checklists, explanations, and full video courses for every section of the exam, including live online classes. I know many of my students are here tonight, so hey all. And Joel, if you could go to the next slide, I've got an overview with some more things I've got there. So I've got the LSAT Unplugged YouTube channel and podcast with tons of free resources, more than you could ever possibly work through. But the good news is that you don't need to go through everything. You can pick and choose what you like, what you need in the moment. I'm going to go through games, reasoning, and reading comp, as well as the Flex, of course. And let's say if you're good on games, you wouldn't need to focus on games. You could focus on the other stuff. And so in the courses, I have much more than even what you see on the YouTube channel and the podcast. I cover the basics, and tonight I'll just stick with the basics generally, but I've got plenty of advanced material and master classes as well. As for results, I mean, I can claim all sorts of results. I do have, in fact, many students who've scored in the high 160s and 170s and beyond with big score increases, but I'm going to share with you in the chat a couple of videos with just a couple of those success stories. one student who took my courses and went from a 135 to a 161, another who went from a 154 to a 164, and many, many more. I also, aside from the videos in the chat, I've also got LSAT Diaries where students wrote in with guest posts chronicling their experiences along the way. So if you just Google LSAT Blog Diaries, you'll find many of those. Joel, if you go to the next slide. Yeah, so the overview of the LSAT. So this is pretty much the LSAT standard. You've got logical reasoning, 2 sections of that on the regular LSAT, only 1 on the Flex. You've got reading comp, games, the writing sample, and for the regular LSAT, the experimental section. Logical reasoning was half the exam. Now it's only 1/3 on the Flex. Reading comp and games remain the same at 1 section each. The writing sample is no longer at the test center itself because there is no test center. And it's also previously, even before COVID, it was moved online anyway. And so that was LSAT's chance to try out what would it be like to administer something online. The writing sample, of course, is that proctored online. Now it's online like everything else. Does the writing sample matter? I mean, Joel could maybe speak a little bit about that on the admissions side, but my understanding is that because it's typed now, because it's online, they can actually read what you're writing. They maybe have more reason to look at it than they would have previously. As for the experimental section, that is not in existence for the Flex. They're not even doing it for the Flex anymore, which is a reason why the Flex can't go on forever as is. LSAC does need a way to test out future exam questions. Regardless, the experimental is unscored, so it doesn't count, but they don't tell you which section it is. So just something to be aware of there for the Flex. We don't have it, just the 3 sections, and I'll get more into that later. Next slide, Joel. So the LASER approach. So LASER is an acronym standing for Learning, Accuracy, Sections, Exams, and Review. And that is the framework underlying my LSAT study plans. And so learning is theory, basically reading textbook chapters, watching videos, covering the basics. Then A is for accuracy, individual questions by type, drilling to get the proper perspective from which to view each question. So what is a strengthening question versus a most strongly supported question? What is necessary assumption versus sufficient assumption? It's really important to know the difference, but it can be tricky to sometimes know what they're even asking you about. And so accuracy, that second phase, is where you figure that out. Then S is doing individual 35-minute timed sections to work on pacing, how you allocate your time. E is for endurance and exams. For the regular LSAT, doing 5-section exams. For the Flex, doing only 3-section exams, but either way, it's all about properly simulating test day conditions. And then R is for review, which is really what was the key for me in unlocking my own LSAT success and is the key for so many of my students as well. In my courses in the master classes, we go into more depth on this, but the idea is basically what I call the Socratic review method. The Socratic review method, if you just search my YouTube channel, you'll find me walking through it several different times, several different contexts. The idea is really to understand where your misunderstanding stemmed from. Was it in logical reasoning, for example, the stimulus, the question stem, the answer choices? Could be any of those areas, and figuring out where exactly your misunderstanding is coming from is the key to avoid making that same mistake once again in the future. I know some folks said they were having trouble accessing my Google Drive link. If that's the case, I'll make sure to fix that after I get off this call and you'll all be able to access it. Next slide, Joel. Thanks. So logic games. Logic games, for those who aren't aware, you've got, this is the shortest section of the exam, by the way, only 22 to 24 questions. And so on the Flex, this is actually by far the least important relative to the others, maybe a little bit more than on the regular, but either way, not the most important, except for the fact that it's the most perfectible section of the exam because it's really the most mathematical. I've laid out some details about it here. One thing I want to call your attention to, though, is that and the average of 8 minutes and 45 seconds per game, that is simply an average. I find far too many students have difficulty actually keeping themselves to that strict time constraint when in reality, you don't need to. Not all games are of equal difficulty. Some games, ideally, should be only 5 to 6 minutes long, meaning you should get it done in 5 to 6 minutes. I know it might sound crazy, but it actually is possible. Some games, like the famous CDs game featured in Legally Blonde with the used and new CDs in the different genres, that game, 12 minutes, I would think is totally reasonable on seeing it for the first time. The key is to drill these games, to drill them by type, and then to drill yourself even just in terms of full-length timed sections. And I agree with some of the comments in the chat. I think this is the most fun section. For me, I hated it at first because I was not a mathematical person. That's just not how my brain works. I was much more of a verbal person, so the logical reasoning and reading comp were better for me. But over time, I actually came to love the games because I saw the patterns in terms of how different games relate to each other. And so in a moment, we'll talk about ordering versus grouping. You'll see some of those common patterns there. So next slide, Joel. Thanks. So game types. I think game types are overemphasized, which is why I'm keeping it fairly simple as I can here. Sequencing, grouping, combinations. Some people will say ordering, others will say sequencing, same idea. You're putting things in chronological order or you're ranking them. But idea is you're putting them in some kind of order, so there's a before-after aspect to it. If it's solely relational, I would say it's more relative. But if it's relating variables to specific slots on a diagram, so for example, if you have 7 variables, you're placing in order 1 through 7, and they say that like A is on slot 3, B is on slot 5, that would be more strict versus A is before B. That's a bit more loose, a bit more relative. Then grouping, I've laid out, you've got where you're choosing some, not others, AKA in, out, or selection, or if you're dividing them, or if you're just broadly associating variables of one type with variables of another type, but you're not putting anything in order. You could stop there and get a good sense of what games are about. Then you've got combination games where they're really mixing it up. You might be choosing some variables, not others. Then the ones that you choose, you're putting them in a list or in a row, in a rank or an order of some kind. That gets a bit more complicated. And then, of course, you've also got what I call curveball or weird logic games where they're not even really related to each other. They're just different in some way. And many recent exams, those in the prep tests numbered in the 70s and the 80s, you've got plenty of those. I've got a list of them on my website. If you just search weird curveball LSAT logic games on my blog, you'll find it. And I've listed every logic game from 1 to 80 that has something weird going on about it. And so once you've mastered the sequencing, the grouping, the combinations, and you really want to perfect games, which I recommend, I would say work on the curveballs. And games in general, again, most perfectible. The typical 170 score is getting perfect on games, maybe -1, and then -3 or so on each of the other sections. Can you get a 170 plus getting several wrong on games? Maybe, but it's really tough to perfect reasoning and reading comp because they have those ambiguities of language that games doesn't have. And so it's mathematical. It can be formulaic in certain contexts. And when you get that formula, when you see the relationships, it really does unlock itself. And you'll kind of just know what to do through your subconscious in a way, through your intuition, through having done so many games up to that point. Next slide, Joel. Thanks. So logical reasoning. So like I said, on the regular 5-section LSAT, you've got 2 sections of logical reasoning, 1 games, 1 reading comp, and then the unscored experimental section. On the Flex, though, you've only got 3 scored sections, and that's it. So in that case, you've got logical reasoning as 1/3 of the LSAT Flex. So it matters a little bit less on the Flex, and games and reasoning, reading comp matter a little bit more. Now, these questions are bite-sized. They're not related to each other typically. So you have 25, 26 questions typically, and question 3 does not relate to question 4. So that's good and bad. If you didn't like question 3, well, you can move on and just go to question 4 and start fresh. Alternatively, with games and reading comp, you're really investing yourself a lot up front. And if you are, then in that case, that could pay off well if you really got what the game or the passage was about. But but if you didn't really get what the game or passage was about, then you've got a problem. Logical reasoning doesn't have that. Logical reasoning does have the clearest general order of difficulty, though, because they're bite-sized. And so question 20 will typically be much harder than question number 5, but maybe 18 is actually harder than 20. But within games, game 1 might be easier than game 4, but the questions within a game are not really difficulty ranked in quite the same way. Again, average amount of time, approximately 130. In reality, maybe more like 125 or 123, meaning 1 minute and 25 seconds. Again, I wouldn't time them strictly, though. I would never time individual logical reasoning questions because, again, some are harder than others. So maybe question 20 will take you 2.5 minutes, and that's fine. Maybe some will even take you 3 minutes, But again, that's okay because you might have gotten one of the easier questions in the first 10 or so in maybe 30 seconds or even 25 seconds, believe it or not, if you just get it through intuition, because the method of reasoning really is that simple. I get questions about pacing a lot. I had a question about pacing submitted in advance, and really, how do you deal with that order of difficulty? I would say if you're aiming for 165 plus or 160 plus reasonably, I would aim to do the first 10 questions in approximately 10, 12 minutes, which is a fast pace, less than 125 or 130, but that builds up a time bank to allow you to solve the tougher questions later in the section and devote more time to them. And you can move on to the next one, Joel. So, two types of logical reasoning questions. You have some where the stimulus is assumed to be true and the answer choices are under suspicion. So that would be like inference questions. Must be true, most strongly supported, main point. You're not really challenging the stimulus or challenging any sort of perceived gap there, if there is a gap, if it is an argument. Then in the second category there, where the answer choices are assumed true and the stimulus is under suspicion, that's more like strengthen, weaken, evaluate the argument, resolve the paradox. They're asking you which one of the following, if true, would do X to the argument, strengthen it or weaken it. And it's really important to view the question from that proper perspective, which is why drilling the A for accuracy in that laser approach to LSAT prep I mentioned earlier, that's why drilling is so important, because it helps you know which of these two that you're dealing with. You go to the next one. So again, that first category, stimulus assumed true, I would fit these question types, necessary assumption, flaw, parallels, pointed issue, and so on, into that first category. You'll notice a lot of these involve articulating something about the stimulus, like flaw questions, method of reasoning, role of the statement. You're not actually doing anything to the argument. All you're doing in these cases is really just describing what's going on. Same for those bottom inference types. You're describing what's happening. You're not actually attacking the argument or strengthening it or doing anything to it. You're simply describing what's going on. Next one, Joel. Thanks. Yeah, so this is a different category where we are doing something to the argument. So strengthen, weaken, we are, of course, closing that gap or further exposing that gap in those cases. So it's really important to say to yourself, no matter how extreme the choices seem, doesn't matter, we're taking them as true and seeing what consequence they would have if true. Next one, Joel. Thanks. Okay, so again, I'm not going to do a deep dive on this, but again, feel free to, of course, screenshot these. I'm describing what you need to be doing in those cases. So in those cases, you're addressing the answer choice in a particular way to make sure that you're articulating what needs to be articulated. Next one. Thanks. And so this one, again, describing what your job is. It's really important to know your job. If you don't know your job, if you don't know the task at hand, you're not going to be able to solve the question appropriately. Too many times students read the stimulus, they're like, I don't really know what this says. Let me go to the choices and see if that helps. Going to the choices is not going to help because the choices only make sense in the context of the stimulus and in the context of the question type. So if you don't know what method of reasoning is, you're not going to get method of reasoning questions right. And reading the choices will only further complicate what you're doing because they're giving you more information that you can't place in the appropriate bucket. So students, again, they too often, like I did, jump into full-length timed exams or individual timed sections without doing the hard work of learning. You're basically getting the theory and concepts down, and then A for accuracy, drilling questions by type. I know it's really tempting to see what your section result is or what your full-length exam result is, but again, you've got to do the work first in order to get those results. If you're doing diagnostics, your diagnosis is not going to be very good unless you do the hard work first to build your understanding from the beginning before getting into the timed work, in which case you'll really see your scores rise. Next one. Thank you. Okay, so again, more describing your job for these question types. I don't need to go into the details, screenshot it if you like. Next one. Thanks. Again, next. So again, more on resolve the paradox. Your job is, I know that we're a bit behind on time here, so I don't want to belabor all of this, but some of the links I put in the chat, we'll get into this as well. So approach, logical reasoning approach. Joel, could you go back one moment just so that somebody can screenshot that? One more. She's saying one more. All right, sufficient assumptions. So yeah, you're looking to close the gap 100%, leaving no ambiguity at all, which means it doesn't matter how extreme the choice is for this category. Doesn't matter as long as it gets the job done. So we could go ahead to the logical reasoning approach now. So I like question stem first. Some others like stimulus first. Plenty of top scores on both sides of that epic debate. I used to read stimulus first. Now I read question type first or question stem first. I think even when I was reading stimulus first, I wasn't really reading it first. I would kind of take a sneak peek, or I'd go back and forth several times, in which case it was irrelevant which one I read first. But the idea is that the question stem gives you that proper perspective from which to view the stimulus. That's why I drew that initial distinction between the stimulus assumed true and choices assumed true. But either way, you do have to understand the stimulus deeply. You have to know whether it's a fact set or an argument, and then you take the proper approach moving forward. Fact set, you're making connections, you're linking things together. If it's an argument, you are evaluating the gap in the argument. Is it reasonable? Is it unreasonable? Those who have been to law school, I haven't, they'll tell you there's this reasonable person test where it's really in the eye of the beholder. It's based on common sense, whatever that is. The good news is the LSAT is not asking you to evaluate how reasonable something is. That even can't really be quantified that well. But I say reasonability because, and I'm not sure if that's a word, by the way, the idea is that you want to engage with the argument in a real world sense, like you were having a conversation with somebody. Logical reasoning is not really about formulas. It's not really about diagramming. Games might be, but logical reasoning is really mostly informal logic, which requires evaluating it like you were having a conversation with somebody, and that will allow you to better determine what you're dealing with and how to approach it using all those different question types. Reading comp. So reading comp has not changed since June 07. You've got now 3 long passages, 2 short dual or comparative passages. Again, you have that average of 845 per passage, like you have 845 per game. That is simply an average though. Some are easier, some are harder. I worked through the riddled basins of attraction passage with somebody recently. I think that's from Prep Test 50. Super tough passage, 12, 13 minutes, no question about it. Same goes for this passage on the Big Bang Theory and the creation of the universe and the multiverse. Super hard passage, again, 12, 13 minutes, not simply 845. The idea is some are easier, some are harder. Don't time yourself on individual passages. And again, the order of difficulty is really hard to say. Passage 1's probably easier than passages 3 and 4, but other than that, I wouldn't obsess too much over it. But for a top score for 160, 165 plus, I would typically recommend attempting all 4 passages, just like I would all 4 games. Topics: humanities, science, social science, law and politics. You could go ahead, it's fine. Yeah, so humanities, you've got some, next slide, if you don't mind. So you've got, I've broken down some typical or common topics for these passage categories. You're gonna have one on each of humanities, law, natural science, and social science. At least one of those 4 will also be on minorities or women. And so just be aware of that going in. And humanities, objectivism versus subjectivism is, I think, one of the most repeated passages, topics on the LSAT. It'll take a variety of different forms, but I've seen this come up again and again and again. So if you're not comfortable with those concepts, look them up, go on Wikipedia. If you encounter a passage that gives you trouble, and if you get a general sense of what it was about, look it up, get comfortable with it, because it very well could come up again. I actually have a list of reading comp passages, topics that repeated multiple times. This first one, objectivism and subjectivism in general, has come up several different times. Get a good sense of what that's about if you don't like it, because it could very well repeat. So prior knowledge could help, it could hurt, but either way, I would suggest you not go beyond the passage in terms of content, but you can still use your general knowledge from the past to help you better understand what you're reading and to better bucket it. You could go on, Joel. Thanks. Okay, so yeah, so it's just I'm just listing some other common topics. You'll notice I mentioned dinosaur extinction there in the natural science category. Of course, you see several logical reasoning questions on that as well. So make sure you're comfortable with your dinosaur extinction. And again, the reason these topics come up in both LR and reading comp is really because they're not meant to generate an emotional response. So for example, I mentioned passages on minorities and women on the reading comp. Is it going to be about Black Lives Matter current events? Definitely not. They're going to talk about a scholar of some kind, and they're not going to be totally negative or totally positive. The tone will typically be something like qualified approval or modified or moderate skepticism. Yes, being a humanities major can definitely help. And obviously, law passages, some folks don't like the law passages. I get it because they're more academic in nature, but try to get interested in these because after all, you do want to go to law school. And I get why you wouldn't like natural science. But again, it's not really about the topic. It's much more about your evaluation of the way they go about presenting the information. And they're somewhat dispassionate about it. They're not looking to generate strong emotional responses, but do what you can to caricature or exaggerate a little bit about it, just to get a little bit more excited. That helps a lot. I had one student who would always say like, hell yeah, when she's reading as she goes through these, to just try and like, oh, for real? Like to just try and get a sense of like she's having a conversation with somebody. Michonne, for those in my courses who know her. Yeah, so this is just some more common topics that have come up in the past. Yeah, so again, just if any of these you don't like, they've all appeared, so get comfortable with them. I talk about outside knowledge a little bit. It can help, it can hurt, but don't actually use it to help you solve the questions, but use it to help yourself get a general framework about what's going on. You don't need it, but obviously it could help a little bit. Reading for structure. That's the biggest thing I would think about here. Read for structure. Don't read for the details. On the digital LSAT and the Flex, you do have highlighting and underlining tools. They're not the most precise. They're not the most useful. I wouldn't rely on them. I would certainly test them out beforehand to make sure you're comfortable with how they function and their limitations. I find the most reliable thing is to make markings, minimal ones, on your scratch paper to the side and stick with that. As for scratch, you get five sheets of paper for the Flex, which is 10 pages double-sided. On the digital, who knows if and when that'll come back, you get a booklet of 12 to 14 pages. And they don't specify the size of the paper. So those who are legally minded might want to try using legal sized paper, 8.5 by 14 rather than 8.5 by 11, up to the proctor's discretion, but people have successfully used it. And as Hannah is mentioning in the chat, you can use Control F on the Flex. Control F is permitted, which can really help you to quickly find keywords back in the passage. And you can move on to the next one, Joel. So where they come from, they're not from the real world. There is nothing that is directly quoted from an academic journal. LSAC adapts materials from the real world and rewrites them for use on the LSAT reading comp. And so I found one case where they were taking a book review from the New York Times and adapting it for a reading comp passage. And so I could compare them side by side, LSAC's boringification of that topic for the reading comp versus how it actually appeared in the New York Times. Of course, the New York Times articulation of those ideas was far more interesting and engaging than the LSAT ones. And so these are purposely written to be legalistic, to be structured like contracts. Not the most exciting, burying the lead sometimes, not the most engaging, but be aware of what they're doing there. And yes, again, Control F is allowed. LSAC has confirmed this. You will be fine. The Flex, biggest difference, like I said, one section of logical reasoning, not two. If you want to simulate it, you can use LawHub, aka Official LSAT Prep Plus, to simulate the Flex. Idea is simply skip one logical reasoning section from the exam and do your 3 sections back to back, no breaks. I've actually learned that they do give a short 1-minute break between sections, but pretty fast. And do your practice tests on the computer, not in a tablet, not in a book. Practice like a game day. You could go to the next one. Yeah, so for those wondering, for the Flex scoring, logical reasoning is not double weighted. All questions count equally. So easy questions count the same as hard ones, and logical reasoning counts no more or no less than games and reading comp. The scores are still given to you on the 120 to 180 scale. Law schools have, as far as I've heard, universally confirmed they will consider, and Joel can speak to this as well, consider Flex scores the same as regular LSAT scores. If you got a 180 on the Flex, they're not going to say, oh, well, it's just a Flex score, not a real score. It's the same. Again, the size of the paper is up to the proctor's discretion, and the proctors you can't see the proctors, but they can see you. Kind of weird, something to get used to. Maybe you want to do a study with me or a live stream to simulate what that experience is like. It's kind of weird. I mean, but you get used to it the more you do it. I mean, that's kind of what I'm doing right now. I can't see everybody here, but I've gotten used to doing these sorts of webinars. I'm not saying you have to be able to do this, but you got to get used to it, at least for one proctor to watch you. And the flex tests are undisclosed, by the way. So you won't actually see your raw score. You won't actually see, you'll only get your score out of 180 from that 120 to 180 scale. To get a rough approximation of your flex score, there are many calculators out there. They all vary wildly. None of them are perfect, but two different methods here. One would simply be to take your initial raw score for the 3 sections you complete and multiply it by 4/3 before converting it using that exam's raw score conversion chart. Alternatively, you might just want to take your overall accuracy percentage and use that as a baseline to simulate your score out of 180. But this is just a rough estimate. So give yourself a margin of error or a score band of a couple of points on each end, just to give yourself a general sense of where you're going to be. It's not perfect, but close enough. And obviously you always want the highest accuracy possible, regardless of what the actual estimation might be. Some good advice in the chat about controlled breathing to prepare yourself and deal with the stress. That's a great idea. For scheduling, the one little scheduling hack or trick, because the scheduling a specific time is really up to you on test day, that you have a range of times available from 9 a.m. to 7 p.m. Eastern time in 20-minute increments. I put some tips here on this slide about how to schedule early on the given scheduling date. LSAC will announce it typically a few weeks before it's actually available, but you might book your October LSAT, and of course, scheduling is not available yet. So it comes along a bit later, but use this trick to basically log into your ProctorU account to schedule early. Basically, LSAT creates a ProctorU account for you, and you can reset the password to log in. Now, score preview option. This is a new score preview option for first-time test takers. That you pay a fee, $45 if you pay before, $75 if you get stressed about what your result was and you want to see. They like their fees, they like their money, but if you have a fee waiver, it is free. Good news there. And this score preview option, it's only for first-time test takers. So if you've ever taken the LSAT before, if you have ever even taken it and canceled, no good. But if you are a new test taker and never have sat for an LSAT before, score preview will be available to you, and you can see your score before deciding whether to cancel. Law schools will never know that score if you do choose that option. Pretty cool. Removes the stress a little bit. Other big policy change to know about is that you must complete the LSAT writing before LSAC will release your score. They open up the writing sample 8 days prior to the actual start of that LSAT Flex administration for that given week. So you could do it beforehand. You could do it maybe a few days afterwards. I wouldn't wait too long because, of course, you don't want to hold up your score being released to you. And if you do cancel your score, LSAC will know, they will note it on your record that you canceled. And so you can go ahead to the next one. So as for meeting LSAT scores, as Joel said, you need to meet a certain threshold with LSAT and GPA. For the top 14 law schools, these are the top 10 approximately. And as you see, they have quite high LSAT medians, high 160s, low 170s. Obviously, if you have a lower LSAT, a high GPA could make up for that. But if you have a low one, you want a high of the other. But that's generally, there's a clear association there. And then law school acceptances, this is from Joel's end, so I'll hand it back to him. But yeah, so lots of great acceptances there.
Yeah. So I'll mention one last thing, which is just sort of our programs. Basically these can be divided into 3 categories. Candidacy building is where we're working with students who are still a year or more away from applying, or approximately a year or more away from applying, helping them with things like choosing activities, choosing courses, choosing a major. Oftentimes we're doing things like helping set them up with academic internships or internships with organizations, like NGOs, things like that. Application counseling is what it sounds like. It's where you already have your scores. We're working on the essays, choosing a school list, letters of recommendation, your resume, everything through until acceptance. And then application final review. For those of you who aren't interested in doing sort of like full programs, one thing I do generally suggest to students is that they get at least one person with admissions experience in the law school field to review their application before they submit it. It's a lot less expensive than having somebody kind of hold your hand throughout the whole process, and can be a really good way of sort of catching any significant errors, problems. It's just useful to get the perspective of somebody who has read thousands of these, because what you think is a good application will quite often not correlate to what one of those people thinks is a good application. What you think is a good application usually correlates to what other students thinks is a good application, which is another way of saying that a whole bunch of students send very similar applications to the admissions office, and it becomes de facto not a good application. So that is quite useful. Okay, so Steve, did you want to talk about?
Yeah, sure. Thanks.
Yeah.
All right, so this is just an overview of my different LSAT course options. I've retooled everything since I had to discontinue my in-person classes. Just 3 different tiers, different course options. The top tier Supreme includes access to everything, all the live online classes, group coaching masterminds, and Q&As. Then the Premium basically removes the mastermind sessions, and then the Starter is simply the on-demand video lessons. Many different options. Feel free to reach out to me afterwards if you have questions regarding them. And yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say there. I won't take up too much time.
Okay.
Oh yeah, so books. So I've got a variety of different guides, cheat sheets, checklists, explanations, all available through my site for instant download. I'll share those links in the chat. The day-by-day study plans are the most popular option out of those, and those have that laser approach built into them. And then also I have a vocabulary guide, not simply vocabulary like you get in a dictionary, but specific to the LSAT, covering uncommon meanings of words that are tested, as well as explanations for the LSAT exams, since of course, those who've been studying for a while will be aware that the LSAT exams don't come with explanations, which is kind of problematic. And so I really get in depth with tempting wrong answers, discouraging right answers, and what about them makes them tricky or unappealing in many cases.
Okay, if you guys are interested in talking with either of us, setting up a time to chat either about your sort of admissions strategy or about your LSAT strategy, please reach out. The emails provided there. Also, if you have any, it is quite likely, both based on the time and the sheer volume of questions that we received, that we're not going to get to a significant number of the questions. So please do feel free to follow up. Questions that should be addressed to me, you can send to this email here to Kayla, and questions that should be addressed to Steve, you can send it to LSAT Unplugged, and we'll get to as many of them as humanly possible. So, Steve, you have a few minutes to do some Q&A?
Yeah, totally. I'm down.
All right, let's do it. So it looks like there are a couple of there's some good LSAT questions. You want to just take those 3 right there at the bottom? Those are all, I think, or at least, sorry, 2 at the bottom. Those are both for you.
Yeah, sure. I mean, one question, maybe they're in a different order here, but I mean, one question I see them now. Okay. So, I mean, the biggest question I've been getting, I see come up again and again is, will X test date be flex? And so I guess I'll handle that one. I mean, I've been basically predicting that every LSAT will be flex, and my likelihood goes up from 90% to 95% to 98%. But LSAT announced quite early that the November LSAT would be a flex. And so I'm expecting that LSAT has kind of finally recognized this reality that we're in with COVID, where deciding 6 weeks prior doesn't really make sense, because the quarantine situation, the online education situation basically dictates that they can't do it in person, and it's a huge risk for health and safety to do it in person. So I predict that basically the LSAT for the foreseeable future will be a flex, and with every subsequent LSAT administration that is a flex, we've at this point had at least, I think, 5 or 6 LSAT flexes for 2020 altogether. That January LSAT, February LSAT, and so on. I think it's going to be flexed for quite a while, at least until we have a COVID vaccine at this point. What was the other question?
There's the for the November test, if I start studying now, can I realistically get a 160 plus?
Okay, yeah. So if you start studying now, I mean, I can't really chance somebody for LSAT score results having not worked with them or not spoken with them at all. I generally recommend, though, a minimum of 2 to 3 months, and ideally 5 to 6 months to reach your fullest potential on the LSAT. So we're now speaking approximately 2 months before the November LSAT. That's really the bare minimum I'd recommend if you start studying now. If you're able to study full-time, meaning at least 25 hours a week, I would say that will help you maximize your odds, but I think you're probably better off not rushing it and going for January or February. And Joel, you could speak to this, but I would imagine that applying even a month or 2 later with a significantly higher LSAT score is worth it.
Yeah,
it's worth the wait.
Yeah, almost certainly. Depends on what months we're talking about, but yes, almost certainly. Yeah, generally, yes. Okay. How many schools do you recommend applying to? How broad a range do you recommend? I mean, it depends on whether like the application fees sort of is a factor, but assuming that it's not, and you want to get into a top 14 school, then my recommendation is to apply to 14 schools. I have a possibly cynical take on law school admissions, which is that like This isn't college. It's not about, where it's not about where you feel at home and it's just like about what is the best place to get your career started. Like, if it's a professional degree. If I were you and I wanted to get into like a top 14 law school, I would do so. In terms of like the range of schools that you're applying to, generally speaking, a minimum of 3 to 4 schools where you are at or above the median, both for GPA or LSAT. The kind of remainder of the schools that you apply to is obviously kind of a combo of fit schools where you are at or slightly below the median in one and at or slightly below the median in the other. You're not below the median in both. Or schools where you were below the median in both, and that's a reach school. Generally speaking, it's not uncommon to see 3 reach, 3 to 4 fit, and then 3 or 4 of the sort of safety. Usually the numbers the kind of numbers that matter most is the safety school count. So 3 to 4, I would say there. Do the law schools take into consideration how rigorous your undergraduate school was when looking at your GPA? Yes, absolutely. There was another question that was above that I noticed about canceling scores and how schools look at this. And Steve, I'd love your perspective on this as well. Generally speaking, what I have advised students to do is, like, unless you feel like you bombed this test, canceling it is probably not worthwhile. They do definitely see that you canceled tests. If you're the kind of student who have taken and retaken and continuously canceled tests, it does look bad. The particular question asked was, would they rather see a 160 grow to a 170, or would they rather see it canceled in 170? My inclination is that the difference is not significant, which is to say that, if you go from 160 to a 170, admissions officers will be inclined to assume that the first score is an aberration. They'll sort of rule in your favor. If, on the other hand, you have like a 162, a 164, and then a 168, they're more likely to think that somewhere in the middle is really where you should be. So if the clustered scores, although they say they don't average them, definitely heard reports from admissions officers that they are not averaging them explicitly, like with a calculator, but that they're kind of considering them all together. Whereas really disparate scores, they tend to err in your favor. So that is all to say that if you've really just done it, if you know that you've done an abominable job, like canceling is fine. You should be. Steve, anything you like to add?
Yeah, sure. I'll jump in on this one. So yeah, I would generally agree that a 160, then a 170 versus a cancellation at a 170, not a huge difference. The cluster, though, I think that probably does add some context that's hard for anybody to ignore. And they're human beings. They're going to interpret that cluster and say, okay, it's somewhere in the middle. But if you just walk out of the test feeling like it didn't go as great as it could have, and you have that vague sense of doom associated with it, that's totally normal. It's easy to walk out of the test feeling like you had no idea how it went and focusing inordinately on the problems that you didn't really know about. But because it's vague and you can't point to it and you have imperfect information, you go based on the emotion alone, when in reality, it probably wasn't that terrible. But alternatively, if you know for a fact that you bombed a game or bombed a reading comp passage or both, and you normally don't, or you totally misunderstood something completely, and that's unusual, then yeah, maybe you want to cancel, but you really have to be able to point to something specific. And I think most people shouldn't cancel. And in fact, cancellations to me are really a relic from back in the days when law schools averaged multiple LSAT scores. Now, at least in the US, and Joel, you could correct me, but my understanding is that virtually no school in the US doesn't average. And so for that reason, there's not much downside to keeping the score. And a lot of people would have canceled scores and luckily didn't, and end up doing great. There are people I've spoken with who've gotten in the 170s and thought of canceling, which clearly would have been a mistake in those cases. So I would say most people shouldn't cancel.
Yeah, I from that. And I guess the times where I've seen that it was very obvious they should cancel was like something horrible happened. Like they were incredibly sick on the test day, like ran out and vomited in the hallway, like that's probably a good opportunity so that you don't have to write a letter to the law school explaining why you got like a 140 and then a 170.
Right.
But
One thing I add on this is with the Flex or the digital, like all the tech issues that some folks have had, they're limited cases, but they tend to get a lot of play online on forums like Reddit and such because people are pissed off as they should be. I get it. But if you have a major Flex tech snafu or like your internet totally cuts out or the proctor takes over your machine and interrupts things a lot, then that's a pretty decent reason to cancel because you can expect that next time around, hopefully that could be avoided with better proctor training or a better internet connection, in which case you could retake it and do much better. But outside of some external force like that causing a problem, I probably wouldn't cancel.
Debbie, I think we got to that question. Jenny, what are the odds for someone who's a splitter to get into top 14? It depends very much on what the split is and also what undergraduate school that they went to. Like I had plenty of students who've also had plenty of friends who had like low 3 GPA, high 170s LSAT score from a good undergraduate school and ended up at Harvard, Yale, Stanford. It's not super common, but I've definitely seen it plenty of times. It's not a fluke. So it depends on sort of how high you are in one versus the other. Generally speaking, I would say that like your chances are fine. If you are genuinely a splitter, meaning that you're in the 75th percentile for one of those two things, particularly for the LSAT score, and 25th percentile for the other, you have a very solid chance of getting into a top 14 school. You do need to make sure that your extracurriculars are on point. So start thinking about what is your area, what's your field, what's your persona, build a profile, do extracurriculars, do internships related to it so that you're not just reliant on your numbers. If you are resting all of your hopes on your numbers, your chances of getting in are severely diminished. Law school. The scholarship question from Scott about GRE versus LSAT. I haven't seen anything specific to whether or not they withhold scholarships or grant scholarships on the basis of which test you've taken. So I doubt very much that they ever would do that. It would be a huge disincentive from taking GRE. So I'm unaware of anything that would affect that decision. There was another question above, Steve, which was about what is the latest, if you want to attend law school in the coming September, not this month, obviously, what is the latest test you can take or should take?
Oh, to me, that seems like even more of an admissions question. So I might want to throw it back to you. This comes down to that November versus January thing from earlier, right? So if you're starting now, it's a little bit late in the cycle to be thinking about the LSAT. I might even suggest holding off an entire year because I'd say January is the earliest by which you could reach your fullest potential or close to it. But then you have that trade-off of being a little bit later in the cycle. So I'd say ideally I'd say ideally you would have taken it in August, which is approximately a week ago, the August Flex, or you'd be taking it in October 1 month from now, or November 2 months from now. Ideally, I wouldn't be starting to prep now though. I would have started back in June, maybe. What do you think?
Tend to agree. Usually we've said sort of the fall administration is the latest that you should take it. In terms of a time frame for studying from now, I defer to you. But in terms of like all things equal in subsequent years, what is the latest that you can take? It was October when I was taking it. I take it that it is now November. But yeah, the fall administration was really the latest where you could reliably get the information that you needed to the schools in time. Like some of the schools just had earlier deadlines and or were rolling admissions and you didn't want to wait. So that's really the only consideration.
Yeah, so I'd say in that case that for those looking ahead right now, for those who are thinking maybe I'll apply next fall, I'd say start studying this winter or in the spring, take it in the summer, and then give yourself some time. That gives you some time to potentially retake it in the fall. And now the LSAT's nearly every month, so you've got plenty of retake opportunities. I wouldn't aim to take it every single time. In fact, there are actually retake limits I didn't mention, but they exist 3 times in one testing cycle is the most important thing to be aware of. But I'd say probably take it October, November at the latest for that cycle, if you can.
When is the best time to apply if you are a splitter? As early as you can. And that's generally speaking the best time. I mean, the reality is that admissions offices will say, well, it doesn't matter if you apply later. Never really made sense to me because obviously they're filling the class. Unless they are making decisions all at the same time, as long as there's any rolling basis to the admissions, they are filling the class as they go, which means that as fewer spots are there, it's going to be more competitive to get those spots. So I'm not sure that being a splitter has anything to do with whether or not you're more, I wouldn't say like the strategy should be meaningfully different. For any applicant, you should apply as soon as you are able to have a good LSAT score and have your application ready. and as soon as possible when those two conditions are met. What should one do if they're already out of undergrad and can't really build a profile? Oh, yeah, absolutely, you can build a profile. I mean, you build a profile with the work that you're doing professionally, and you can build a profile with like volunteer work. It's the same as when you would do an undergrad. You would do, you do extracurriculars, and now you do volunteer work. So I've had a number of different students who were, years out of undergrad. They were doing things like, actually, one who I was talking to might have even been someone who's in attendance tonight. It might be that recent that the exchange was happening. He was doing investment banking and was interested in education. And so she was like, I don't want to do investment banking, so I've stopped doing that right now. But I also don't want to just sit around and do nothing. And so one of the things I recommended was like, get a job that pays money and volunteer, do something related to education, which you were going to do anyway, so that when you apply to the school, you have something to draw on. So you have some experiences that sort of contribute to this persona of education policy person. Probably must have been something that I was talking to today, because it's been in the back of my mind. What should you start with? So Steve, this is for you. What should you start with, or should you begin to study for the LSAT if you've been out of school for a while?
Being out of school, I think it doesn't really change anything, except it might mean it's a little bit of a longer road because your academics and taking tests might feel a little bit rusty. So I would basically allow more time. For those who are looking at LSAT prep really far out, I would say maybe you want to do some light reading before you get into the specifics of the LSAT. So maybe that could even be like reading. A great book recommendation, by the way, is called A Rule Book for Arguments by Anthony Weston, A Rule Book for Arguments. It kind of covers all these different informal logic arguments that are related to the LSAT. It's not an LSAT specific book, but that could be useful to kind of dip your toes in the water a little bit. Or folks will often talk about reading The Economist or Scientific American, or reading dense, difficult text. That's a good way to kind of get warmed up. But overall, I would just say allow more time. Start earlier. Those who are in college have a slight advantage with the LSAT because they're used to that rhythm of taking timed LSAT exams and doing difficult, dense reading that we kind of tend to, on average, move away from once you get into the workforce in most cases. So I would say allow more time is my biggest recommendation there.
What's a good undergrad and grad GPA? It depends enormously on what you mean by good. For generally speaking, magna summa cum laude is that's generally speaking students in those areas we see most consistently getting to top 14 schools. So like sort of a below a cum laude cutoff or whatever that is for your school is probably the cutoff for like highly competitive for top law schools. For the most competitive law schools, summa. For sort of the remainder of the top 14, magna. But it really depends on what school you go to. It depends on your undergraduate major. If you have below a 3.5, chances are that you're going to be below the median for most top law schools in most cases. This is actually how I should have answered this question to begin with. Most of these law schools publish the median or the 25th and 75th percentile range for admitted students' GPAs. You want to be over the 50th percentile. That's a good GPA. And so it really goes by both law school and also by undergraduate institution as well. Toya asked, what minimum score do most folks getting a full scholarship with? I don't think there really is a minimum score. Honestly, the sort of full scholarships have to do with a lot of things. They have to do with like your personal backstory. They have to do with your GPA, your undergraduate school. They have to do with like diversity factors, like ethnicity, sometimes religion. I got a scholarship to Harvard Law School for being from Vermont, which was bizarre. It was a it was an unusually large scholarship for a really random thing. So there really isn't a minimum score. It also depends on what schools you're going to, right? So if you're at like the 80th percentile for LSAT score and GPA, and you're applying for whatever this law school is that you're applying to, the chances that you get a scholarship there are a lot higher than at a school where you're sort of at like 50% for both. So generally speaking, what we see is that you get bigger scholarships as you move down in terms of the rankings relative to your qualification. So if you're qualified for like, I don't know, tier 2 or whatever it is, you're more likely to get a full scholarship in tier 3. Erica asked, Steve, do you provide one-on-one tutoring?
Yeah, I do. I really call it coaching more than tutoring because it's not simply working through problems, but anyone interested in working with me could reach out and email me. We could talk more about it.
How does it look if I get a reference later from a tutorial assistant rather than a professor? Good. Generally speaking, anybody who's teaching undergraduates, that's optimal. Or rather, in this context, teaching law students would be best. But somebody who is working as sort of in a professorial capacity is great. Ideally, you can get something from like a law school professor or a law school clinic instructor. That's more likely. Doesn't necessarily have to be a professor, but somebody who can speak to you as compared to like current law students, that would be ideal. Steve, for you, if you have score preview, should you cancel if it's a relatively bad score, i.e. below 160?
Depends on your goals. I mean, this is kind of unprecedented with one exception from back in July during the digital LSAT rollout. But below 160, I mean, it depends on what school you want to go to and what LSAT score you need. And it depends on what looks bad. I think if you want to avoid that cluster issue, then if you were scoring around a 164, maybe you don't want a 160 on record. Alternatively, there is a security in having that 160 down and on record in case you couldn't retake or couldn't replicate it due to something else going bad in the future. But I don't think this is actually really that huge a deal. I think score preview is nice just because it can relieve the stress associated with potentially having what you consider a terrible score on record. But again, because of all the reasons we talked about earlier regarding cancellations not really being necessary in many cases, I don't think it really matters that much. It's more just for peace of mind.
Sasha, your question about whether or not kind of upward trajectory of grades matters, the answer is yes. Obviously, it would be optimal if you had the same high grades throughout.
Ooh, looks like we lost Joel. I'll give him a minute to rejoin before we might want to wrap up for the evening. He is not a robot. I can confirm. I think it's just poor internet, but a wide internet connection could also prevent the perception of one being a robot, which is what I've got. So who knows? We have one question in the chat. Joel, I think Joel's rejoining us. Joel, you back? I think he's still reconnecting. I'm going to address one question I saw here in the Q&A section on the Flex. Someone was asking if you're allowed to speak to yourself or read out loud during the LSAT Flex exam. And the answer, in short, I've talked to you about this directly, is that you can't. And that's because they want to avoid the perception of you talking to somebody else in the room or talking to a secret microphone you have hidden in your clothing that could be transmitting the exam content to other people. The exams are, they're undisclosed. LSAC is not releasing them. They're saving them in the bank for future LSAT test dates. But if you were secretly recording and transmitting the information, then that would pose a problem for test security purposes. So you cannot read out loud to yourself, which is kind of unfortunate. A lot of people like to. It's called oftentimes, I call it subvocalization. This is in like the speed reading world. People will talk to themselves or mutter under their breath or mouth the words to themselves as a way of processing the information. The problem with this is that it actually slows you down a bit as you're reading. You kind of set a ceiling on your overall reading speed when you subvocalize. And so I would actually recommend, regardless of whether it's allowed or not, it's not allowed, by the way, again, just to confirm that. But I would suggest you try to avoid doing that in general, whether you were able to read out loud to yourself or not. I would avoid it altogether. I see a ton of questions in the chat. I'll try to keep addressing them, and we'll hope that Joel can rejoin us. Joel, you back?
Yeah, I think let's wrap up there. If any of you guys, for the admissions questions to Kayla, for LSAT questions to Steve, thank you guys so much for being a very participatory audience. It really makes this much more fun and enjoyable for both of us to do. Steve, thanks so much. As always, I always learn something from listening to you. So really a pleasure. And sorry guys for my internet connection. If I could solve it without burning down Comcast headquarters, I would. But I'm saving that for retirement.
This was a blast, Joel. Thanks for having me on. This was great.
Yeah.
And folks, feel free to reach out anytime to either one of us. Good night, all. Stay safe. Be well.
And Izzy, the answer is yes. Please reach out over the website or reach out through Kayla. All right.
Good night, all. Take it easy.
Guys.
Bye. Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them. And feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I'll wish you all the best and take care.